Hello and welcome to The Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock, broadcasting from my constituency office in Lindsay, Ontario, on this special COVID-19 edition of The Blueprint. As of right now, we unfortunately have 26,163 cases of COVID-19. Those are confirmed cases right across the country, and that's of April 14th. More than half of those cases are in the province of Quebec. So we're all trying to do our best. We're trying to plank the curve, as it's called, and get back to what we hope will be a normal right across the country and across the world in general. A great show lined up for you today. We have our East Coast, or our first East Coast MP on the show. That was my apologies to our friends in Atlantic Canada. We haven't had an MP from that area on the show yet, but Chris D'Outremont is on the line. He will be talking to us about the Atlantic fishery, amongst other things going on in Atlantic Canada. But first, we have John Barlow. He's the Member of Parliament for Foothills in Alberta. He's also the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Barlow.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Jamie. Good to see you, my friend. It's been a long time. We've been on opposite ends of the country, and Chris is you as well.
Yes, it's unfortunate we are put in this situation, but we're all doing our part, which is commendable. While we're doing our part, obviously Canadians are adapting to this new reality, and part of that is ensuring our supply chains. And we're all talking about different supplies, but most importantly, food. And in this case, ensuring that our agriculture is able to get its product to the producer is then able to get it to the next step and eventually into their grocery chain. So maybe we can just talk about, that we in rural Canada know how important agriculture is. This is a message I think everyone in rural Canada is trying to put into everybody else in some of the cities that don't recognize the role agriculture plays. But maybe you can tell us a bit about how and why we're recognizing it now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think if anything comes out of this COVID-19 crisis, I hope Canadians, especially those in urban centers, have a much greater appreciation about agriculture and the work that our farmers, ranchers, producers, agribusiness owners are doing to keep food on our plates, but also in our grocery store shelves. And hopefully they have a new understanding of modern Canadian agriculture and the critical role it plays in our supply chain. I just don't think that many Canadians realize how vital it is when you've always gone to the grocery store and there's always been shelves full of protein and fresh produce and those types of things. But that has been a very different situation right now. And if we don't have the food in place and the producers are able to do their job, we could really see a shortage of supply coming into the summer and the fall.
So Ontario was dealing with its own problems prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, specifically in terms of beef production. There wasn't enough capacity within our supply chain, ensuring there was a significant backlog in cattle that weren't getting to the slaughterhouse. And now we're dealing with COVID-19 circumstances where we have in the West Coast, we're having an oversupply of hogs because you can't get them produced. How is the industry itself adjusting to this new reality to ensure that they are able to get the animals through and meet this demand?
Well, I think that's, even before COVID-19, as early as this middle of December, we were asking for the federal government to put programs in place like the set-aside program to ensure that we have a backstop for the cattle industry specifically, especially in Ontario, that's had significant capacity issues with the closure of Rider Regency. And that's just been exacerbated when we've gone through the COVID-19 crisis. So it's essential that our processing plants, whether that's cattle, pork, poultry, are operating. And we've been really putting pressure on the federal government to make agriculture and food an essential service and critical infrastructure. They went part of the way about 10 days ago, making an advisory. We want them to make that mandatory to ensure that those processing plants are able to keep open and operating. The ripple effect, if we lose any of those plants, is quite significant. And we've already had 4 plants either as partial closures or complete closures throughout the COVID-19 crisis. And we are seeing now producers are having very hard conversations. Do we start culling herds, euthanizing animals? We have to ensure that is a last resort. We have to come up with some different options.
Well, I think that would be a very difficult conversation to have, especially given the fact that people still need to eat, and we are still seeing shortages in some areas due to a lack of supply, and that's the production part that you're talking about.
Absolutely, and there's only time is of the essence when we talk about agriculture. They've been building up their herds and their animals, and now we're having producers make hard decisions right now about this planting season. Are we going to plant what we had planned before? Do I have the labor to harvest, to seed? Is there going to be a market there for me? So we need to ensure that agriculture has the tools it needs to be able to do its job. And I think when we don't only have to look short term, but we also have to look long term. When we come out of this, we are going to have maybe a $250 billion deficit this year alone. We're going to be looking to industries who we know are reliable, that can help us climb out of this financial crisis. And when this is over, people are still going to be buying food. They're going to need to feed their families, and not only here in Canada, but around the world. So if any industry, we need to be clicking on all cylinders and help us get out of this. Agriculture is one of them. If they have to euthanize animals or adjust what they're seeding, it's not something you can just flick a switch and get it ramped back up. It takes months, if not years, to get back to where you were.
Maybe we can just talk about the slaughterhouse industry just for a little while longer. Basically, in the point where the importance of, or the difference, I should say, in having a federally inspected processing facility or a provincially inspected processing facility. Maybe you can give us a quick rundown on the difference. I think we have lost John Barlow. I think we're working on him. So what I was getting to John Barlow about was the difference in the processing capacity. I think we have him back. Did you hear that last question?
You just wanted to ask. You were asking about the processing plants.
Yeah, just so people understand the difference in a provincial facility or a provincially inspected facility compared to a federally inspected facility.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jamie, and there's definitely 2 different levels. So only in a federally inspected plant can the product from there be moved or exported out of country, out of Canada to our international markets, but also out of that province. So I think where we're seeing an issue here, and so provincially inspected plants, the product can be sold anywhere within that province, so Ontario, for example, but it can't even cross provincial boundaries. So I think, if anything, this is highlighted from this, is we need to be much more value-added, self-sufficient, and have a true Canadian free trade agreement where provincially inspected products from provincially inspected plants, which in many cases are very close, if not superior to federal standards, those products can be traded outside of the province. So if you have a shutdown of a plant in Quebec, as we did with the Olymel, or Cargill here in my riding in High River is now down to half capacity, that you can rely on other plants in other provinces to pick up that excess and then be able to trade it not only across Canada but around the world. So right now there's 2 different standards between federal and provincial, and it's very restrictive.
In a previous show, we talked about transportation issues, and specifically regarded to this portfolio, agriculture. The problems in the transportation industry when connected to agriculture were there before COVID-19. We talked about a lot of grain not being able to get out of Western Canada and reach the next step, how it's getting backlogged, and now we're seeing animals and so on and so forth. Are there any steps we can be taking as an opposition or as the government should be taking to help alleviate some of these transportation issues?
Well, there's a couple of things, and the first, as we've already talked about really briefly, is the essential service. We need to ensure that railways are moving, ships are being loaded, elevators are being able to operate, and that is from coast to coast. And I think if you were talking about the fishing industry, would be very similar. So for aquaculture as well as agriculture. The second thing is the Liberals put in some very restrictive new transportation guidelines when it comes to livestock, so which really is, we're feeling the impact of this now, that it really limits the amount of time that an animal can be in transport without having to be stopped, unloaded, fed, watered. These are guidelines that really are not based on any science and any data. So right now, for example, if you had riding Regency closed down in Ontario, it's very difficult for Eastern Canadian farmers to move their cattle or move their livestock to processing plants in Western Canada because of the time and the distance that it takes. So we've seen the restrictions that this has had, not only within provinces, but now the impact is when you do have a problem in one part of the country, it makes it very difficult to move cattle to another part of the country to be processed. So A, making it an essential service, and B, not proceeding with those new transportation guidelines on livestock, because it just doesn't make sense. It's not logical, and it's not based on any science.
So last week, I think a lot of people read stories about dairy farmers having to make the very difficult decision to dump some of their milk for a wide variety of reasons. Maybe you could just quickly go over some of those reasons on why that was happening. I'm sure for any dairy farmer, that was a horrible decision for them to have to make, and very difficult to have to open the taps like that.
Yeah, and I think Canadians need to understand that the scope that we're talking about here, when in Quebec, one province alone, they were dumping, more than 12 million liters of milk a day, which is, an incredible. But when you don't have schools open, Tim Hortons, Starbucks, most restaurants, there's not a market there for your cream, your butter, and a lot of milk. So although you'll see your shelves at the grocery store usually have milk and those things, it's the hospitality sector that we've lost, or those dairy producers have lost. And as supply management goes, you're producing milk and other products to meet the domestic demand. But when you see such a sharp decline in those domestic options, so we've been working with dairy farmers to donate as much of that product as we can to food banks, to other nonprofits. But there's only so much that's available to them to find that excess product. So there is the Canadian Dairy Commission does have some funding set aside to buy some of that supply, and then do with it what they will, and then provide some financial backstop to those producers in the short term. But this, we'll have to see how long this lasts, and producers are going to have to scale back their production.
Now, in some cases, producers aren't, it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't set up in a lot of cases to change over from a restaurant where they would order more quantities and more like a bag of milk or a bag of cream to the single serving that most customers are the retail customers are used to, and they're just not tooled that way, and that will take time to get them to change their operation.
Yeah, for sure, and that's on the processing side, that they have relationships that they've built up, and very specialized processing and packaging. That you can't turn around on a dime. They are going to have to be a little bit more agile, and again, that goes to the point that I think when we come out of COVID is there are still going to be borders closed around the world. We are not going to be having the export markets that we've had in the past, and then maybe for months, it could be for even longer than that. So I think from this is we have to learn to be much more self-sufficient when it comes to our food supply, but also increasing our value-added opportunities and processing capacity here in Canada, that we aren't as reliant on, even some of our most important trading partners coming out of this. We have to start doing more processing, more manufacturing here in Canada, so that should this ever happen again, we are in a much better position to weather that storm.
John, maybe we can quickly touch on this before I let you go. I know you're busy, and we have Chris chomping at the bit to get on. In terms of temporary foreign workers, this was a story again in the news the last couple of weeks anyway, and their connection to the vegetable industry, passion fruit, etc. Maybe you can talk about why farmers need the temporary foreign workers, and which are workers from other countries that come into Canada for a certain length of time. They work, and then they go back home and take their pay with them, kind of thing. And it's a good deal all around. But maybe you can tell us why it's needed, and why it benefits the farmers, and what the issue during COVID-19 was.
Yeah, we've had a program in Canada for more than 50 years that's been very successful, and that's the Seasonal Ag Worker Program. So we bring in about anywhere between 50 and 60,000 temporary foreign workers each season into Canada, helping with the planting season, the harvest season, and these are workers that are spread across Canada, but very much focused in southern Ontario and southern BC in the horticulture industry, but we have them in Alberta as well in the feedlot industry for sure, honey and the bee processing and honey processing. But these are and there's a lot of misinformation out there. These are very highly skilled people who have chosen agriculture as a career. So their skill set are very highly sought after, and they've come to Canada in many cases for decades. The same person's going to the same farm. But right now, obviously, the issue is we've got millions of Canadians out of work. But these are jobs, especially on the seasonal side, that are seasonal. But these are jobs that Canadians traditionally have just not wanted to do. So even now, to all of a sudden ask a Canadian who's been laid off from a gym or a restaurant or a hotel to go on farm and start doing these jobs which they're not trained to do is very difficult. And I guess in the long term, maybe hopefully we'll see some more Canadians being interested in these jobs. But even with the temporary foreign workers, traditionally, there's 100,000 to 120,000 jobs available in agriculture on an annual basis. So even with the seasonal ag worker program, it still doesn't cover the resource gap. And these jobs are critical for our food supply and our supply chain. Without them, farmers wouldn't be able to plant. They wouldn't be harvesting and processing fruits and vegetables. And we would really see the impact on our store shelves in the fall if we didn't have this labor force. We just wouldn't be able to meet domestic demand, and we wouldn't be able to plant what we're able to do now.
One last thing, John. I promise you the last thing.
It's okay.
When we talk about agriculture, you're talking about getting people into agriculture. When we talk about getting younger people to get into agriculture, take over the family farm or invest in a farm and start a business that way. At the end of the day, taxes make a difference. Rules, regulation make a difference, because nobody is going to get up every single morning, break their back to not earn a living. And I think this is, whether it's agriculture or any industry, people need to be able to make a profit in order to get them motivated to go into a certain industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think attracting the next generation into farming is absolutely vital right now. The average farmer in Canada is getting close to 65. In the next 10 years, we're going to see a massive transition. But we'll only see that transition if we attract young farmers into the industry. They have to see this as a viable career choice. Certainly for most of us who grew up on farms or around farms, it was a lifestyle choice, and we all enjoyed it. But now you have to look at the financial implications. Is it viable? And I believe it is viable if we give them the tax regime, the regulatory regime that works and makes them competitive. The amount of technology and innovation on farm now is incredible. It makes it really interesting for young Canadians who are more tech savvy, certainly, than the generation before. But we have to ensure that there are low interest loans, capital gains exemptions, and good succession planning through business risk management programs that allow them to get into farming without being burdened with massive debt right from the get-go, but also be able to make that transition from one generation to the next in the family farm much easier to do. And even through all of this, that is one of the biggest anxieties I know all of us hear from our stakeholders and our constituents is, how do I get my farm onto the next generation, whether that's my kids, my nephew, my niece, whatever. And those are some of the things that we need to address once we get through this.
John Barlow, Member of Parliament for Foothills in Alberta and the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food. I could talk to you about this for hours, so thank you very much for the short period of time you have lent us today. And you stay safe, stay healthy, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jamie. Always a pleasure. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you. And Chris D'Entremont, the Member of Parliament for West Nova, is coming up next. Stick around. He's going to bring on a wealth of experience as a former health minister provincially. So we're anxious to talk to him. So remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint. Stick around. Part 2 coming up next. Welcome back to the second half of The Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, for the Lakes Brock, broadcasting live from my constituency office in Lindsay, Ontario, as we do our Tuesday edition of The Blueprint, COVID-19 edition. And on the line, we'd like to thank John Barlow. He's the Member of Parliament from Foothills, for joining us in the first half. Currently joining us is Chris d'Entremont, the Member of Parliament for West Nova. He's also the Shadow Minister for Official Languages and ACOA, or the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us. You're the first East Coaster on the show.
Well, it's good to have that distinction, but lots of stuff going on around here too.
There is. Now, as the Atlantic provinces deal with COVID-19, some of the headlines in the news pointed to the fact that although you have a smaller population, unfortunately, you have a smaller healthcare staff to deal with any COVID-19 cases or any of the other realities of life, the cancers, the heart attacks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, in the area, of course, we have a smaller healthcare system. I mean, that goes without saying. But the second part is the issue of our aging population. We have a lot of people in long-term care facilities. We have lots of people with different kinds of chronic diseases, whether it be diabetes or cancer or what have you. So we're having a real tough time in trying to avoid some of the stark realities that we're seeing across the country. Even though, I mean, if you see, PEI tends to be small. It's got 25. Newfoundland right now is running at about 244. New Brunswick's running at about 116, and we've got about 474 cases here as of today. We've got a couple of deaths. It hasn't been, it's sad for those families, but it hasn't been as stark as it has been in Quebec or even in Ontario at this point. But I think we're just sort of catching up with that wave right now. Our March break was about a week after your March break, or a couple weeks after the Quebec March break, which we're seeing a lot of those people that have traveled contracting that disease. So, I think we're tracking where the rest of the country is, but we're seeing a little bit of a flattening right now. So some of the things that have been instituted when it comes to self-isolation or social distancing, those are actually starting to work quite well. It's not going to get us out any sooner, but at least it's going to save the healthcare system a little bit and not having that load of patients showing up at the doorstep of the hospital all at the same time.
Now, in a previous life, you were a MLA in Nova Scotia. You were also the Minister of Health. So maybe you could just quickly touch on the amount of moving parts right now within the health ministry in terms of all, I guess, parts of the government provincially trying to deal and think of the next steps when talking about COVID-19.
It's quite a hierarchy as we look at it today. I mean, we have the country, the health officers that are making the decisions from a Canadian standpoint, but all of those are being enacted by the local governments or the provincial governments. So if you have here in Nova Scotia, we have Dr. Robert Strang, a great individual that's been our public health officer here for many years. He's been doing, I think, a great job in explaining the situation here in Nova Scotia, coming up with ideas on how to try to stop that spread, being mean and mad when he has to be, to try to tell Nova Scotians and Canadians this is what you're going to have to do. But the department itself is split up in Nova Scotia, split up in 2-3 ways, where you have the public health side of things that are handling the COVID outbreak, but then you have the operation of the hospital system, which here in Nova Scotia is split up in 2 different health authorities, which is the IWK, which is the children and women's site, and of course the larger Nova Scotia Health Authority, which actually operates the hospital system in Nova Scotia. So you have a lot of going between and making sure that you're ready for the surge as that surge bumps up. For years in Canada, the problem we run into, what's really coming apparent is for years, surge in Nova Scotia meant that there was probably help coming from New Brunswick or there was help coming from Ontario. But since we're all in the same boat at the same time, that surge capacity is not in the system that we normally would have seen on smaller outbreaks of different diseases. So this is the challenge, I think, that all provincial provinces or provincial governments are seeing right now, is that they can't call on their neighbor to a certain point to get the help. It's good to see Alberta has been doing a wonderful job in providing N95 masks and other surgical equipment, other equipment that's needed, PPE, across the country to Quebec, to Ontario. So it's good to see those who have the capacity are helping out others, but it's very difficult when we have this many people suffering from this disease.
Now, one of the main industries within Atlantic Canada is, of course, the fishery. We're all familiar with, the fresh seafood you're able to supply a lot of Canada and the world as well. Talk about the effects COVID-19 has had on that industry.
Well, we have to almost go back to December to see the first effects of COVID-19 on our fishery. So a number of years ago, our fishery was diversified into different markets. So the majority of our market would go to the U.S. But because, you don't want to put all your eggs or fish in one basket, you try to split that up in different markets. So Europe was opened up a number of years ago, and probably for a long time it was half and half. And then then Asia became probably a third, if not a half of our market for fresh seafood. It's a huge market. It's easy to get into. There's flights out of Halifax every day to bring our product to that area. One of our biggest connections is into Wuhan, China. So back in December, when that part of China was being shut down, our fishery was starting to take a hit, even back then. Of course, when we had the rail blockages, that was the second hit. And then, of course, now with the closure of the fishery, not the closure of the fishery, but a closure of this social distancing issue, that the quantity of fish is not required that we would normally see. The biggest fishery we have here is lobster fishery. The season itself in my area is mostly underway until probably the end of June. So the product really has nowhere to go at this point. So you're seeing a dramatic drop in its prices. So the fishing vessels, the little enterprises, they're all little enterprises, are having a tough time selling the product, and the middle guy, the buyer, is really working with no markets to send their product to. So it's getting all caught up very quickly here.
Now, the government of Canada has introduced a whole suite of programs to help those affected by COVID-19. Are those fishers you're talking about, are they falling through the cracks, or are they able to find themselves a program to tap into?
Well, some of the larger companies are having an okay time in accessing it. They have a number of employees. They can show the loss of income over that amount of time. They're showing 15%. They're showing 30% in some cases. The problem we run into a lot of the vessels. Some of them are corporate, but a lot of them are owner operator. So when you have the owner operator issue, does that wage supplement or wage subsidy help out the guys on the back of the boat versus the guy that owns it or running the boat? So there's some challenges and some gaps that we're seeing within that wage subsidy program that we hope that the government is going to fix, but we're going to continue to bring that forward to whatever medium we need to make sure they understand.
Another province, Newfoundland and Labrador, has announced it's having some issues dealing with COVID-19, among other things. They've basically announced they are going to go insolvent, and yesterday the premier said that they are going to run out of food potentially in about 5 days. Now, I don't expect you to answer in depth on what's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador, but maybe this can go to the point of how important supply chains are in our confederation, and how important they are to keep them open so that we are able to keep our store shelves stocked.
Well, I mean, Newfoundland's been having a tough go for a number of months, if not a couple of years now. Even though they're an oil-producing province, there are challenges on building Muskrat Falls and a couple other issues that have hit their doorstep quite hard, that they're really having a hard time borrowing money right now to fund the system as it goes forward. As far as Premier Ball brought this issue forward, it really revolves around where our products come from. I mean, our products, we would think, from a grocery store standpoint, they show up to the grocery store. How hard is that? But if you think how far Newfoundland is away, it's got to go through New Brunswick and PEI, or New Brunswick and Cape Breton to get off to the island. There's a trucking problem that we're having right now, that we don't have enough truck drivers to actually keep those things open. So there is going to be a challenge right now of keeping the grocery stores open in Newfoundland. I know Nova Scotia has been trying its best to try to help them in that. I don't think it's as dire as that, but it's quite a pronouncement when you hear a premier say that they're not going to have product in 5 days. I mean, that is something that we really need to be working as Canadians to try to fix.
Is there any talk about repurposing a ferry system to get that food into the province?
Well, here's the funny challenge: is Marine Atlantic provides the ferry service from North Sydney to Newfoundland. There are 5 vessels that they use on a regular basis. So depending on the loads required, they can expand or contract the service as it goes along. The problem we're running into is we don't have, because we're telling people to stay home, or people are worried about contracting COVID-19. They're having a tough time staffing the vessels as is needed. So I know there's a challenge there from Marine Atlantic to get the ferry system going back and forth between our provinces. And just again, the truck driver. I have a brother who's a truck driver now that goes into the States right now. There are no services for them as they go and drop off and pick up product. So it's making it very difficult for those individuals.
Yeah, we're having the exact same problem in Ontario, and I think it's happening right across the country. It's ensuring that the truck drivers have the facilities they need in order to allow them to do their job that they're doing. So a big shout out to the truck drivers, the mechanics, everyone involved in keeping our supply chain strong. Chris, do you have any parting words for us as we get ready to sign off here?
Well, ultimately, it's just, I've been trying to contact and talk to my constituents or on a regular basis. We're trying all kinds of different new mediums to do our jobs. I mean, our job, a lot of the times is going to Ottawa and debating issues. It's being in a riding to talk to people. It's going out to different events to talk to people. It's very difficult when about half of that job is not available to us, or that mechanism to actually talk to our constituents. So, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on the blueprint, but we need to continue to do a lot of work and using these different medias to actually get out to our constituents so that they know that we're trying our best to get services to them, trying to get help to them. And during this time, we just need to all work together.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, you're doing a great job. Congratulations on your election in 2019. You're a great representative for West Nova and, in fact, the province of Nova Scotia. Keep up the great work, and we thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you come back again because we have a lot more to talk about.
Jamie, anytime.
Thank you very much. Chris D'Entremont, he's the Member of Parliament for West Nova. He's also the Shadow Minister for Official Languages and ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of The Blueprint. We'll be back on Thursday at our usual time of 1:30 p.m. Eastern to talk about the issues facing Canada right across the country. So remember, stay safe, wash your hands, keep isolated, don't travel unless absolutely necessary, and we will get through this faster together. And as always, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint. Thanks for joining us.